In this week's kind of like, again, this is completely optional videos that I'm making here, I decided that I did not want to talk about the bond market. So even though it is actually at the forefront of my mind, I decided that after making several videos just talking about that I don't want you to think of me as just the bond person. Instead, I want to talk about this kind of lingering way in which economists have been wrong this past 2 years, maybe even 2.5 years. And it started out that economists were wrong, as I talked about in the previous weeks, where economists were quite surprised by the inflation that emerged after COVID. I'm not sure economists should have been that surprised. I certainly wasn't surprised. But in general, the people with money, the people whose opinions matter more than my own, didn't expect the inflation that occurred in late 2021 and in 2022. So in late 2022, the realization was we really, really, really need to fight this inflation, which doesn't seem to be going away. And so then the result was we need to start taking actions to cool the economy down. Right? And you can see that if we look at just the federal funds rate on Fred, um, what we can see is that in 2022, we've had a series of steps that accelerated rapidly towards the end of 2022, where essentially the Federal Reserve increased the interest rate. And when we say that, we mean that the Open Market Committee raised the federal funds target rate. That whereas in 2022, it was essentially zero, that today it's over 5%. And now we're in this period of time here that we've been in through much of after the first quarter of 2023, where we've been in long periods of time where it hasn't changed, where it's been rather constant. And so, how do we understand that? Well, we understand that by the fact that when 2023 started, the expectation was that we were going to reach a recession that was intentionally caused by this increase in the interest rate. But the expectation was that the recession was going to occur towards the second half of 2023 and that it was going to be rather slight, what was called a soft landing. And yet, we're not seeing that. So if we look, I'm just going to guess here, if we look at the Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal somewhere in here is going to tell us that things are not as bad as we thought they were going to be. Let's just try to see if we can see something that backs up what I'm saying here. I mean, just to guess in general here, we have stocks increasing because everyone is beating earnings expectations. But even if we just go to the economy section, here we go. Oh, here we go. This just proves my point for the best. The economy was supposed to slow. Instead, it's revving up. So how do we understand that then? I mean, what do economists really know? Because we seem to be getting it wrong all of the time. We got it wrong about whether inflation was going to happen. Then we got it wrong about how to slow the economy down to stop the inflation. And yet the inflation is also persistently still there as well. So let's talk about forecasting, which is really kind of the primary focus of what I wanted to look at this week. So if we think about what it is that makes an economist worth their weight, it would be their ability to make predictions, like a weatherman. You're right. Well, it helps that men are economists are overwhelmingly men. So in this case, when I say weathermen, I'm really just kind of highlighting that fact, right? But basically, anyone that is trained in meteorology has a profession that's designed to make predictions. Economics, because it wants to be recognized as a science, tries to do the same thing. And probably the best place to look at would be on the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank website. And what they do is they collect what the surveys of what forecasters, the predictors, are all saying. So let's look at this. This is for August 2023. And what do we see here? We see that economists are making revisions upwards in how fast the economy is going to grow and how many more jobs it's going to get. And so what we see here is that economists, these forecasters, used to predict that in so this was made in August, right? So they were predicting that the economy is going to grow by 0.5%. Now it's growing by almost 2%. And that for 2024, it was going to increase by 1%. Now it's 1.1. And so now and look at this. So what they're doing is they're just delaying when the recession is going to come to 2024. So then look at the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate, lower in the beginning, right? And even then, with the recession that's predicted here still occurring. So that's in essence the soft landing, a slowdown in economic activity without the accompanying unemployment. Then let's look at inflation. And what we see here is these predictions, at least, that inflation will continue to decrease. What sense do we make of these? Well, there's a really interesting way to actually talk about what happens in these surveys. So let's go back to some of these earlier. Let's go back here and let's go back to 2007. So I want to go back to the time right before the 2008 crisis. So the prediction in 2007 made about 2008. I don't want to talk about inflation. Let's talk about real GDP. They predicted that the economy was going to grow just slightly less than 3% throughout 2008, when in fact the economy utterly collapsed in Q4 at least, but even by Q3, even in Q2 of 2008, the economy was collapsing. And that the unemployment rate was going to be relatively stable when in fact the real unemployment rate was double that. Okay. So the prediction in general here was wrong. Let's go back here to now 2008 and see what's happening now in 2008. And then look at that pretty significant change here, right? That they used to predict 0.7, now it's negative 2.9. So that's quite a significant change. Whereas they were predicting 1.6, now it's negative 1.1. And that they predicted that the recession would largely end by Q2, when in fact we were still feeling the remnants of the 2008 financial crisis pretty much through 2011 and 2012. And that the unemployment rate, yes, increased, but not anywhere near the degree to which we actually saw it. So let's now go to 2009. I'm going somewhere with this, don't worry, guys. So now what we see, right, is again these predictions that things will, they made predictions here of what it used to be, what they thought it was going to be, and now they're scaling them back. So here's what we actually get from this, right? And also too for unemployment rate, that it was that they had these estimates and that they became larger. Here's what we learned from this. The biggest thing that we learned from this is that forecasting an economy, an entire economy like the US, as complicated as it is incredibly difficult, likely to be wrong, and that perhaps the only thing you actually capture in terms of information from these projections is not the actual number that they predict for a quarter, but actually what I would argue that the most meaningful piece of data is how the estimate is changing. That in other words here, you can say now by the fourth quarter of 2009, I didn't look at each quarter here, but at least in the fourth quarter of 2009, there is a realization, at least among the forecasters, that this was not going to be a normal recession and that they became then more pessimistic and that it took quite a while for that optimism to turn into pessimism. I mean, we saw that, right? In the 2008 fourth quarter, we didn't see that pessimism evident, that it was optimism that was stubbornly there. And I would argue is the same thing that we're seeing then today. So let's go back to this right here, our third quarter. What does this reveal to me? It reveals to me, at least, an optimism that doesn't seem to disappear, even though there's other indications that that optimism is misplaced. So what does that mean for all of us here as I try to wrap up just our weekly discussion here? Is that an article like this, the economy was supposed to slow instead of revving up, might not be that accurate. Instead, it just might reflect the fact that when we're making predictions about the future, psychologically speaking, we try to make our predictions based on our experiences in the recent past. And since this 2023 has been a relatively healthy economic year, we're just predicting that the same things that have recently happened will continue to happen. I'm not certain that's entirely the case, though.